All right, so with the election of 1912, the Democrats in 1912 felt that they could take the White House. They've been out of the White House for 16 years, and they felt like they could take this because the Republicans had split the party, if you remember. The Democrats looked to Dr. Woodrow Wilson, the governor of New Jersey. Wilson had been a mild conservative, but had turned into becoming a strong progressive. His background was in education as a history professor, then as president of Princeton University, and as governor of New Jersey, he made a name for himself by standing up to the political bosses, by standing up to trust, and but he made a name himself. Made a name for himself as a liberal as well. At the Democratic Convention, it took 46 votes to choose Wilson. The final vote was cast after William Jennings Bryan, who had been, the nominee for the Democratic Party for so many years, finally threw his support behind Woodrow Wilson. So the Democrats now had a candidate in Woodrow Wilson, and they added a platform they named the New Freedom. The New Freedom platform was made up of liberal and progressive policies. Looking at the Bull Moose, or the Progressive Party, at the Progressive Party convention, Theodore Roosevelt was nominated by Jane Addams. If you remember Jane Addams from the Hull House, Settlement House movement. And Jane Addams commented that Theodore Roosevelt, commented that he felt as strong as a bull moose. The nickname stuck, and the Progressive Party became known as the Bull Moose Party. So the 1912 presidential campaign was set, and then the campaign began. You have William Taft with the Republican Party, you have Wilson with the Democratic Party, and then you have Theodore Roosevelt with the Progressive Party. Talk between Taft and Roosevelt got nasty as these two old friends laid into each other, and Woodrow Wilson could pretty much enjoy just letting go and seeing the other two opponents rip themselves apart. Personality set aside, though, Wilson's New Freedom plan and Roosevelt's New Nationalism plan came front and center. The New Nationalism doctrine had been inspired by a book called This Promise of American Life by Herbert Crawley in 1910. You can read a segment or a portion of Herbert Crawley's The American Life with one of my digital history articles that I have put up on my unit objectives grid. But the book agreed with TR on the point that leaving good trust alone, but controlling the bad trust. The whole idea of regulating trust. New Nationalism also pushed for female suffrage and other social programs such as minimum wage laws, social insurance programs, and a lot of these programs would later become a reality in the Great Depression with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. The downside is that some of these socialist programs would be a hard pill for people to swallow, business folks and conservatives. The New Freedom program of Woodrow Wilson supported small businesses, but wanted to bust up all trust. Woodrow Wilson did not distinguish between good or bad. All of them have to go. The plan also did not include any social welfare programs. One thing to note with the 1912 election is that Theodore Roosevelt was actually shot in the chest in Milwaukee. Although shot, he actually went on and delivered his speech and then went to the hospital, recovered in 2 weeks. He was actually shot, and his speech, which was folded up, was so thick that it slowed down the bullet just enough. And even though he had a bloody shirt, he still was able, and even though he had a bullet in himself, in his chest, he was still able to give the speech and then go to the hospital. Kind of speaks to the type of man that Roosevelt was. The results here, with the Republican Party split, it was time for the Democrats to win, and Woodrow Wilson won the 1912 electoral vote handily. He got 435 votes. Roosevelt had 88, and Taft had 8. If you look at the popular vote, it was a lot different. Wilson only got 41% of the popular vote. Theodore Roosevelt and Taft totaled 50% of the vote. So most people in America didn't want Wilson as their president. It just turned out that way. But the conclusion seemed clear. Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party had cost the Republicans and had given the Democrats the White House. The Socialist Party continued to be on the rise. As I mentioned earlier, Eugene Debs got 6% of the popular vote, around 1 million votes total, and which was a strong showing by a third party. And again, it was a sign of the times that people were liking what the socialists were saying. Taft didn't just go away after one term. He's later going to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So Woodrow Wilson in politics. What is he like in politics? A little background about Woodrow Wilson. He was born and raised in the South. He sympathized with the Civil War. This may have influenced his self-determination policy with World War I, where people chose their own government. It also may have influenced the fact that during his administration, Washington, D.C. became more segregated than at any time previously. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and Woodrow Wilson himself was a deeply religious man. He was a superb speaker, something I know nothing about. It was noted that he was born halfway between the Bible and the dictionary, and he never strayed far from either. And so definitely an intellectual. When we look at the League of Nations, some people say that he was before his time. But being this intellectual and being this devoutly religious person also had its drawbacks. Woodrow Wilson's personality was very much unlike Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson was an idealist, not a pragmatist like Theodore Roosevelt. He was completely stubborn at times, and when he had his stroke during the Treaty of Versailles League of Nations debate, he's going to become more stubborn. He doesn't like to budge on an inch on his ideas or his beliefs. Consequently, his stubbornness meant at times that he wasn't going to get anything done. Woodrow Wilson was an intellectual but lacked the people's touch. Whereas Theodore Roosevelt had been loved by the people, Woodrow Wilson was seen as arrogant. In other words, whereas Theodore Roosevelt might have had a beer with the people, Woodrow Wilson would have scoffed at their ideas and their ignorance and move on. Woodrow Wilson, though, did enter the White House as a progressive, and he entered the White House saying that he wanted to attack what he termed the triple wall of privilege, the tariff, the banks, and the trust. Woodrow Wilson sought to bring the tariff down. So let's look at the tariff first. He helped Congress pass the Underwood tariff, which did two main things. Number one, it considerably reduced tariff rates on imports. And number two, it started a graduated income tax. So the tax rate went up as a person's salary went up. The 16th Amendment had recently been passed legalizing the income tax, and the Underwood tariff simply laid out the rules. Woodrow Wilson and the bankers. America's financial system had been set up by the National Banking Act during the Civil War, and the Panic of 1907 had shown that the system had some faults, and it was incapable of addressing emergency needs. We said that, you remember, it needed that elastic money flow where, banks could lend other banks money to help them from closing the doors. So Wilson set up a committee to look into this banking system. The committee was headed by Republican Senator Aldrich, and the committee recommended what amounted to a third bank of the United States. The Democrats, following the House committee chaired by Arsen Peugeot, concluded that Money Monster, or the Money Monster, was rooted in the banking system. And Louis Brandeis wrote Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It, which fired up people even more to reform a supposedly corrupt banking system. So Woodrow Wilson's mind was made up, and in June of 1913, he asked a joint session of Congress to make up some of these broad reforms to the nation's banking system. And out of this, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This law is going to create the Federal Reserve Board, appointed by the president, which oversaw 12 regional federal banks. The Federal Reserve Act is also going to allow the Federal Reserve Board to have the power to issue paper money, aka Federal Reserve notes. So if you look at paper money, you'll see on the bottom there Federal Reserve notes, and you also see in the corner what Federal Reserve Bank this currency was issued at. Therefore, the Federal Reserve Board could regulate the amount of money in circulation by issuing or holding back paper currency or paper money. The last thing with the triple wall of privilege that Woodrow Wilson does is the trust. Congress passes the Federal Trade Commission Act in 1914, which set up a position appointed by the president again to investigate the activities of trust. The goal of the Federal Trade Commission would be to stop trade practices deemed unfair, such as unlawful competition, false advertising, mislabeling, and bribery. Congress also wanted to strengthen the largely ineffective Sherman Antitrust Act, so it also passes the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. The Clayton Antitrust Act put some real teeth, finally, into antitrust law. It added to the Sherman Antitrust Law, that list of objectionable trust practices. It added to this list by forbidding price discrimination, a different price for a different group of people, and interlocking directorates when you have the same people serving on competitors' boards of trustees. The Clayton Antitrust Act also exempted labor unions from being considered trust. During the early part of the Sherman Antitrust Law's life, the law was actually used against labor unions. And it also legalized strikes as forms of peaceful assembly. Some other reforms that were made during Woodrow Wilson's time as president that followed this triple attack on privilege. The Federal Farm Loan Act offered low-interest loans to farmers. The Warehouse Act offered loans on a security of staple crops. Workers made gains under the progressive-minded Wilson. Sailors were guaranteed good treatment and decent wage under the Lafayette Seamen's Act of 1915. The Workingmen's Compensation Act offered to help federal civil service employees during a time of disability. The Adamson Act of 1916 set up an 8-hour workday plus overtime for any worker on a train engaged in interstate trade. Wilson, some other progressive actions of Wilson, he named Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. This is the first Jewish person to sit on the Supreme Court's bench. But the limits of Wilson's progressivism stopped at African Americans. Wilson did not reach out to African Americans, and this is going to be one of the limits to progressivism. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson did not do a lot to help out the African American community. In fact, Wilson's policies actually moved towards greater segregation. Woodrow Wilson played politics too. Dealing with the business community, even though they largely despised all of Wilson and governments meddling into business to keep the business folks happy and to get reelected, Woodrow Wilson made conservative appointments to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Trade Commission. Also to get reelected in 1916, Woodrow Wilson knew he'd have to lure most of TR's bull moose backers to the Democratic Party. Despite throwing a bone to business, most of his energies were put into the progressive arena. So Woodrow Wilson was really talented at, not alienating the business or the conservative, faction of American politics, but also making sure that he was doing enough to keep the progressives in the fold and making sure that he was doing enough to get their votes. In the last video, we will look at some of the other areas of the progressive era, the Supreme Court, which we had mentioned briefly, the prohibition of alcohol, women's suffrage, and then touch again briefly on African Americans and what they did not see happen during the progressive era.